Tonight we're going to talk about relationship, and I want to make the contention that nurturing relational bonds is the beating heart of youth ministry. In fact, I would say that if you took a youth minister, you would want a youth minister to have a winsome, appealing faith they can share and communicate. But the orientation of that youth minister, what they're going to facilitate and do, maybe the most important thing they're going to do, three things. The most important, I would say, is relationship. What's number two? I would say relationship. What's number three? I would say relationship, right? And this is not an untheological point of view. Why is relationship so important? Because it is both the ground and the end of faith. It's where faith comes from, and it's where faith is intended to go. It's the great commandment, right? Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, thy soul, thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. On this hangs all of this is the show. This is the ball game. The relationship that draws us out of self-centeredness into love of God and neighbor. Relationship is at the center of our faith and the goal of our faith. I had two amazing professors of New Testament. We used to meet in this room, which used to be the New Testament lecture room before it became the common room. And this was my professor, Leander Keck, who was also the dean of the Yale Divinity School. Now, wrote scores of books, one of the most complex, sophisticated thinkers and scholars of New Testament. But when it came to the Gospel of John, he said, you know, from the Gospel of John to the three letters of John, there was a progression of John's theology. It's very complicated. I think I can put it for you like this. In the Gospel, John's theology is love, blah, 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 love, blah, 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 love. When he first writes his epistles, his theology has evolved to love, blah, love, blah, love, blah, love. And when he finishes the third letter, his theology is love, 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 love. Love is at the center of this gospel. Now, after Leander Keck, we had Harry Attridge, who is up over there, over that doorway, another brilliant New Testament scholar and dean of this Yale Divinity School. And Harry, I took his course on the Gospel of John twice, because, you know, it takes a while to understand these smart guys, but I did get this piece of it, which I don't think he would own, because it's, you know, not as complex as all of his thought, but I call it the John Code, all right? I want you to follow the John Code for me. This is the secret code of the Gospel of John. No one has ever seen God, right? It's right in the prologue. John 1:18, chapter 6:46, 17:25, and in the first letter, 1 John 4:12, over and over again. No one has seen God. Look, the creator of 100 million galaxies, each of which has 100 billion stars, that's over your head. You know, that's a little much for the little human to get his arms around. No one has ever seen God. That's point one. But point two, only Jesus, God the only Son, has seen God. John 1:18, chapter 6:46. 3, Jesus will make God known to us. John 1:18. Number 4, Jesus will send his Holy Spirit upon us, and we will see Jesus and know God when we keep his commandment. Jesus says, if you keep my commandment, I will send my Spirit upon you. If you keep my commandment, my Father and I will come and dwell among you. And he's only got one commandment in the Gospel of John. What's the only commandment in the Gospel of John? Love. All right, work it backwards. Here's the code. When you love, Jesus sends his Spirit. When Jesus sends his Spirit, you see the risen Christ, you know God. Loving leads to the experience of the risen Christ and knowing God. But it starts with love, right? Your kids, I don't know, maybe you have much more open kids than I do, but I had kids who were kind of toxically averse to being told what they were supposed to believe. You know, Paul Tillich said, you cannot throw faith into a child's head like a brick. They were resistant to being told what to believe because they wanted to figure it out for themselves. But they were hungry for experience. And when in a loving community there comes that moment where the Holy Spirit starts to break out among them and they experience Christ risen present, you don't have to talk them into anything because they have experienced Christ. Resurrection, a difficult intellectual concept? Not if he talks to you, not if you pray and you hear him respond. Dead guys don't tend to talk. Socrates never talked to me. Abraham Lincoln never talked to me. Jesus talked to me. I'm okay with the resurrection. But that comes from experience, and the experience comes from love. There is a great theologian who is Dorothy Bass. And Dorothy Bass put this together this way. Dorothy Bass. She said, you know, the old church, the traditional church, the pre-modern church had this kind of order of events that the church tried to accomplish. It was believe, behave, belong. If you wanted to join, for instance, a congregational church in New England, you could not even join until you could testify to the moment in time of your spiritual regeneration by encountering the risen Lord. You had to believe before you could be a member of the church. When you believed and were taken into the church, you could behave according to the covenant, and then you would be a true member of the church. Believe, behave, belong. And Dr. Bass says, actually today this is going to have to be in the reverse. In the postmodern age, it is belong, behave, believe. Belong, behave, believe. As you are welcomed in a community that loves you unconditionally and you feel welcomed and supported, you are drawn naturally into the practices, the behaviors of that community. They love me and they don't criticize and they don't bust me and they don't judge me. I guess I'm not gonna criticize and bust and judge others because I'm gonna behave like they do. They pray, I'll pray with them. They worship, I'll worship with them. They sing, I'll sing with them. They forgive, I'll forgive with them. And as you belong and then behave, you experience in those spiritual moments of worship and prayer and forgiveness and love the risen Christ. Belong, behave, believe. So relationship is at the core of youth ministry. But now a really controversial question. Relationship for what end? Why do you want relationship? Are you doing relationship because I'm going to come alongside the young people, we're going to come into relationship, they're going to join the youth group, then maybe they'll join the church and our church will stay alive? Or are you coming along the young people so that you can keep them occupied and in the church so they're not on the streets? At least we got them in the church. Or are you in relationship with them because if you come alongside them and love them, then they will join the youth group and you can tell your boss you've got a youth group? Or are you loving them because if you love them and they walk with you, maybe they won't do drugs? Or are you loving them and walking alongside them because you want them to be biblically literate? Or say the Nicene Creed? These are all good outcomes. We want all those things for our children. But that's a love where you are loving them to get a result. You are loving them to get them to do something, loving them to influence in them. Maybe what we should be doing is just loving them to love them, all right? Here is Andy Root, a theologian who runs the youth ministry program at Luther Seminary, who's written a very provocative book on this, Revisiting Relational Youth Ministry. He writes, "We should not view ministry as a practice in which youth workers influence adolescents, making the relationship a means to a greater end. Rather, we should see ministry as the location where unique persons encounter fellow persons. Therefore, relational ministry from a theological perspective is not about influence, but transcendence, about concretely experiencing the otherness of God within my concrete relational bond to the adolescent. God's transcendence is not remote otherness or absence. God's otherness is embodied precisely in the other person, who is real and present, encountering me in the heart of my existence with the judgment and grace of the gospel. In this way, Christ is present pro me or for me." In other words, what Root wants to suggest to us, all these other outcomes, membership in church, don't do drugs, have safe behaviors, learn the Bible, all these are really wonderful practices. But it begins by just loving the child because Christ called you to love him. Just loving the child because when we love one another, out of that love comes the experience of Christ in the middle. All right? Transcendence, not just influence. All right? Here is the very, very difficult problem if we are launching our ministries into the project of creating relational bonds. There is no substitute for time. You cannot and will never succeed at getting your young people into a room and saying, "I'm going to count to 3, and on 3, relate." When I say relate, I want you to be in deep relationship, ready, go. It just doesn't work like that. Relationship happens as a byproduct of doing other stuff. Relationship happens along the road while you walk together, serve together, love together, worship together, sing together. While you're doing other things and sharing space and life and time together, relationship happens. So it takes time. And time is one of the things that we have a really hard time gathering our young people for sustained time together. But there's no avoiding it. Roger Nishioka, the professor of youth ministry at Columbia Theological Seminary, has come up here, spoken. We got it. Columbia is in the house. All right. I hope you know Professor Roger Nishioka, because he is awesome. And he speaks here about once a year in our program. He has a concept that he's been researching and borrowing with social psychologists in the corporate world called the concept of groupness. And he said study after study after study shows that for groupness to crystallize, for that group to really have a sense of bond, requires 17 to 19 continuous hours, exactly the same human beings sharing life together. Now here's the slightly tricky thing about it. It doesn't have to be contiguous. In other words, it doesn't have to be 17 hours in a row. But if you meet for 3 hours once a week, it's got to be the same people meeting 3 hours, then 3 hours, then 3 hours, then 3 hours, so that you get the 17, 19 hours of continuous time together, even if it's not contiguous in one straight line. But here's the trick. If you have 12 kids on the first night and 2 don't come out back the second night, you go back to hour 1. If you have 12 kids the first night and 2 new kids come the second night, you go back to hour 1. So you keep getting into these resets where you never quite get that bonding of group because you keep having to reset because someone's missing, or someone new just showed up, or someone only comes once a month. And this creates an incredible challenge. It creates this fatigue. A group gets tired of always having to restart the buildup of those relational bonds. So there is a premium on trying to hold the same folks together for regular participation. But there's also a premium on looking for those occasions when you can pick up the 17 hours in a bunch. Lock-in time, right? Retreat time, overnight time, service day time. When you can get the hours continuously without anyone new coming in or anyone new going out, you get the foundations of groupness, which create that deep bond and connection with the kids. All right, how are we going to get the time which is so elusive? How are we going to get the opportunity for people to be together when they are so busy? Of course, we want to appeal to parental support. This is why those vision and mission statements are so important. Here's why this is important. You should support us and help us get your child to our group. You want congregational support and pastoral support. You want to use clear and repeated and consistent appealing communications. Flyers, newsletters, Facebook posts, emails, ping and ping and ping and ping, all right? You also want to establish your franchise time. I am not the most disorganized person in the world, but when that most disorganized guy dies, that's going to be me, all right? So I think I'm kind of typical of adolescence. That's why I love youth ministry. I'm perpetually immature. So adolescents, when you ask adolescents, this week we're meeting at 2 o'clock, next week maybe it's going to be 4. The week after that, hey, can we come in on Tuesday nights? Hey, I'm just asking, can we come Thursday night? Who can do that? Who can do that? Who can remember all those shifts of time? This week, when is it? I forgot. I thought it was 2 o'clock last week. Maybe it's after dinner. I don't know. I can't remember. So you want to have a franchise time, I think, which is regular. It's always Sunday night at 7 o'clock. It's always Wednesday at 6:30. It's always Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock. You don't have to put it in your calendar. You don't have to remember it. You don't have to know anything except, oh, is it Sunday? I have a youth group tonight. Now, you're going to say to me, well, when I tried to do that, I always had 4 kids who can't do it. I got piano practice that night. I got tennis practice that night. I go to see my aunt those days. Well, here's the thing. If you try to jump these days around because their schedules are jumping around, you never, ever, ever win. Someone's always got something to do that's not going to work for your schedule. So my theory is plant the flag. Do the very best you can to understand their schedule and plant the flag. If you're running a rockin' youth group and it's 7 o'clock and Bobby can't come because his piano lessons are at 7 o'clock, he won't come. Next year, they'll change the date of the piano lesson. Own your franchise time and set it in stone, and then let the world start to shake its schedule so they'll come to you, all right? The other thing is appeal to every member of a cluster. You remember we used to talk about cliques, how young people were in cliques, and they certainly are? Well, sociologists now are more likely to call these things clusters. The kids are in clusters of 3, 4, 6 young people. Whatever one wears, they all wear. Wherever one goes, they all go. Well, if only one of them is a member of your church, and the other 5 are going somewhere else, you're going to have a hard time holding your member into your youth group. Why not invite all of them? They might not be members of your church, but they are going to move as a little cluster often, which means get the whole cluster. They're all going to show up because what are we doing tonight? Oh, we're all going to youth group. That's what we do, all right? Try to reach for the whole cluster. The last thing is a hub and spoke strategy. There was a monk and a hermit in the Palestinian desert in the 6th century called Abadar Theos. And Abadar Theos had an understanding of how monastic community happens. Abadar Theos said, Christ is at the center like the hub of a wagon wheel. And we are all spokes. We have almost nothing to do with each other, and we have kind of a hard time getting along with one another because we're human beings. But as we regard Christ and regard what he did for us, we can't help but love him. And we move down those spokes closer and closer to the Christ. And the closer we get to the Christ, the closer and closer we get to what? Each other. All right, each other. So the first point is Christ is the hub at the center of a youth group, and as your young people get to love the Christ more, they find they can begin to overcome that scratchiness that we human beings naturally have with one another. Now, I don't want to be heretical about this, but there's a way in which this is also true of the youth minister. As the youth leader, you have the opportunity in place of Christ to play the hub, which means you've got to go establish deep relationship with every single child. And they might be going, I don't know if I really feel so great about these other kids. I don't know them that well, but I know my youth minister. And as I get closer and closer to the youth minister, that creates the connection of the spokes, that creates the possibility of putting a little wagon wheel rim around those spokes as they spend time together, right? So the youth minister can be the hub, deeply relational, reaching out to each child, going to the high school, going to the football game, the soccer game, the basketball game, the school play, the concert, being in relationship with the child, writing them little notes, remembering their birthday, celebrating their successes, and as your relationship creates the anchor, the hub, that ties them into the youth ministry, which creates the possibility of the relationship among them, which is where the real power of the group begins to form. Youth ministers as hub. The third is, and you know you've heard me speak about this before, in our youth group it was just an incredible breakthrough to lift up senior leaders and then unleash the seniors to be the hub. The seniors were looking for a relationship with each freshman, sophomore, and junior. The freshmen, sophomores, and juniors felt connected into the youth group because they knew they were loved by the seniors, and as they spent that time together, their own relationships grew and thickened. All right, seniors, hubs, spoken wheel. Next thing is that lock-in, right? Remember that continuous time? Find ways in which you can draw them into spaces where the relationship can thicken because you get your 17 or 19 hours. Get some rule with them about the iPods and the cell phones, because otherwise they can just be sitting there all disconnected in the same place doing their own things and texting away all their heads. You ever walked by at a college student union these days? 150 kids, not one talking to each other. Just got the head down, pop, 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 pop. All right, it gets a little bit of a fight, but it is worth saying something like, I know you got wonderful cell phones, I know you got wonderful social media. For the next 3 hours, I want you to put them in the box. We'll take a break and you can get them out, but leave them in the box while we are together so the relationship can form. All right, now that you have time and you have created the foundation of relationship, the question arises, for what purpose? Where are you going? How are you going to use your time? And I think it's worth remembering that the real power of group, the real power of transformation, it's not just an exhortation. Hey, a good sermon can move the needle. a good teaching, a good program, a good activity. Real transformation happens when young people are drawn into a transformative culture that lifts up values that they begin to take on by osmosis because they're part of that culture. Here's the way it's put by Robert Lewis and Wayne Cordero in Culture Shift, Transforming Your Church from the Inside Out. Yet we believe culture is to the church what a soul is to the human body. It is an overall life force that the Holy Spirit uses to give energy, personality, and uniqueness to everything a body believer says and does. Church culture influences everything you do. It colors the way you choose and introduce programs. It shapes how you select and train leaders. Your culture is the lens through which you view your life. If you change the lens, you change your outlook. Change the culture, and everything else changes, including the future. You're nurturing and growing a youth group around practices, values, beliefs, behaviors that is thickening as a culture. And when the entire culture takes on reality, then the hearts begin to conform their behavior to the reality that the culture is holding out for them. What do we do about this? I don't really have that thick a culture. I don't really have that great a set of opportunities to shape a culture. You start where you are. Relationship building is incremental. It's done by accretion. Think of walking past a garage door somewhere and there's just this little wispy strand of a spider web in the wind. That's one relational connection. It's just as wispy and insubstantial as a gossamer strand in the wind. But then you come back with another relational connection and another relational moment and another meeting and another shared experience and another shared worship, and that wispy gossamer strand begins to thicken into a thread, begins to thicken into a string, begins to thicken into a rope. So you start where you are and you just start laying down moments of connection, shared stories and experiences. What tools do you use? You use any tool God has placed in your toolbox. You see what we're doing. We're shaping culture by drawing people into shared time and life together so that those little insubstantial connections thicken over time and become a deep relational bond. Here is one way to think about every single thing you do can be an element of shared space and time together. And I'm going to extend a little bit about what Parker Palmer, a great writer, has developed as an idea for his trust circles. It's a Quaker notion of trust circle, and one of the things they do is they use something called the third thing. We achieve intentionality in a circle of trust by focusing on an important topic. We achieve indirection by exploring that topic metaphorically via a poem, a story, a piece of music, or a work of art that embodies it. I call these embodiments third things because they represent neither the voice of the facilitator nor the voice of a participant. Well, let me give you an example. If you ask young people to come together and say, I think we should start tonight's conversation by telling about the fear that most terrifies you and the loss in your family that weighs on your heart the most, you're going to have a lot of looking at shoes. Right? Those shoes are going to get fascinating in a hurry. That's a lot to ask young people to go into that vulnerable space. But if you have a song that is part of the currency of their culture, and you say, I want to play this song, what do you think the artist is saying? Now see, it's at a safer move. It's not about the heartache in their life. It's not about the loss in their life or the fear in their life. It's what the artist is talking about, and they can hold it out there a little safely until they begin to trust each other while they articulate what the artist was saying. Guess what's going to happen about 35 minutes later? They're going to start talking about themselves, right? How it relates to them. But they got to be able to move into that space with the safety of the third thing. And what can be the third thing? Anything that you experience together and process together. So your moments, those shared life together, those elements of time, they're going to be everything you do, because everything you can do can be some opportunity to share space and time together, to lay down relationship together, to move down those spokes towards community together and have relational bonds. So what are the obvious ones? They are your weekly programming. You're going to shape weekly program around your purpose, your values, and your BHAG, your big, hairy, audacious goal. And kids are coming into that space, and whether it's a worship or a game or a conversation or a study, whatever it is, or a service project, they're sharing space and time together, and then they can process, what did we experience? That's the third thing. What did you see? What was the high? What was the low? and then it becomes more personal as they become safer. Sometimes just ask kids to sit with you at church. It doesn't work so well if you're the senior pastor. You know, the pulpit can get kind of crowded. But if you're not the senior pastor, and it's okay with the parents, ask if they'll sit with you at church, and then maybe see if we can go out and get some lunch together, or go to somebody's house and fry up some eggs. And then you can talk about what happened in church together. That's the third thing. What was the pastor talking about? What do you think of that scripture passage? Hey, which was your favorite anthem that the choir sang today? Shared space and time, third object, sharing life together, and then it thickens into more personally revelatory items. Youth worship, where the youth worship themselves, which can be something they own, it can be ecstatic, it can be transcendent, but it has to speak to them and reflect their culture. But as they construct it together, the mere fact of constructing it together is what? Time and space together, and the third thing, right? Working together is the time together that you're looking for. Singing, as they sing, kids love to sing. But as we were talking about the other day, if you just lay a Charles Wesley hymn on them in a hymn book and say, okay, I want you to put your heads down, we're going to sing this Charles Wesley hymn, after me, ready, go, you might have a whole lot of shuffling and mumbling, right? But as you let them select the songs and the genre, pick their favorites, it becomes their music, not just your music. It becomes their music. They'll not only own it, they'll memorize it in ways that I could never memorize anything anymore. But they know the playlist from the radio. They got all that stuff memorized. Why not memorize the theology of great church music that's in their medium, their idiom? You know what they'll do? They'll not only memorize it, they'll start to play with it and create their own ways of singing it contrapuntally, right? Then they own it. And then it's in their head, and it's shared time and space together. Praying together is a wonderful way to have time and space together. Now, in my experience, when you ask kids to pray, at first they're a little reluctant to lead the prayer. And if they do tiptoe out on the ice to lead the prayer, they might say something like, "That my aunt get better." You know, some kind of very personal stuff where you want to create the spaces for them to just limber up and do that sharing, participate in that prayer, and then eventually learn to pray for one another. Now the relational bonds are going to start to thicken up as they learn the heartache and needs of each other and hear themselves being prayed over by their peers. Traveling together, that's no big thing. We got to get from here to there anyway. That can be the very best place for relationship. We're in New York City and we're taking the subway from 96th Street down to 14th Street. They're going to be together. They're going to have shared space and time together. They're going to have a wonderful time together. Vans, all-time great Bondorama opportunity. An hour van ride. Relationship happens because they're in the same space and time, and they're processing that third thing, which is what they're doing while they ride in the vans. Games, icebreakers, obviously, do we really have to always prove that we are theologically deep in church? Aren't they allowed to be kids? And as they get into those games, that's shared space and time together. Cooking together. You know, you could try to get some parents to cook a meal, and the kids would love to have that meal, and they'd sit there and they'd talk to one another. That would not be anywhere near as wonderful a bonding experience as if they go shop for the stuff themselves and cook it. Kids cooking together or working in the same space and time together, it creates relationship and bonds. Nostalgia Fest. Kids love doing stuff that is old school, stuff they might have done as a child or with their folks or their family, but they've never done with each other. When do children ever go to the grocery store together? Or to the Walmart together, right? They had tended to do that with mom and dad, but taking them into these kind of places together, because you're going to get a common meal and shop for it, they love being in a supermarket together. Laying down common stories and repeating the stories, they're shared stories of the group. It can be very inclusive or very isolating. Here's the way it works. I was in a van once, and there was a newcomer to town who was very good on the field hockey team, was beginning to get some traction with her teammates, so she was starting to feel included. And some of the kids in the car were a little threatened that, you know, who's she to be coming into this group? So they pivoted the conversation away from what was going on to, hey, you remember that Valentine's Day party when we were in first grade? Boom, instant, she's out. She's not part of that story. Build the stories that everybody's part of and tell them over and over again. Vespers and conversations. Here's where your conversation at a youth group meeting or in the middle of a lock-in on a retreat night creates the perfect opportunity for those third things. Ask each child to bring a playlist and bring one song that speaks to something they've experienced or moves them powerfully, and then let them tell the group why. It begins as a story about the artist, it becomes a story in sharing about themselves, and as they share about themselves and feel safe and welcomed, relationship happens. A poem or a story that speaks to me, a movie that speaks to me. Now, all of these create the foundations for going even deeper, but if you want to take it even deeper than that will happen in these relational moments, the only way I think you can get there is by the group owns its own processes. If the group doesn't own its own experience, you're kind of capped. When it's always you telling them what to do, you facilitating, you leading, there's only so far you can get. But when the group owns its own leadership, now they're bought in. I'm only going to read some boldface. It's by Dave Ron, Gaining Broad Support, Shared Ownership. I have since seen the pattern of ownership dynamics repeat itself in countless untold ways. When the kids who are part of a small group feel ownership, they work to make it the best group possible. If they're coming out of a sense of obligation to the youth minister, they won't attend long. When kids catch a vision for the potential of a trip or a retreat, their enthusiastic support practically guarantees that the activity will be a winner. Catching the vision means working with them as the owners and planners of the retreat, and then the drivers and the champions of the retreat. What you want is some leadership cadre to share the vision with you, and then share the partnership of leading the group with you. Now, leadership comes in all different ways. I used to think when I first started youth ministry, I could spot a junior who was a particularly good leader or a sophomore who was a particularly good leader and then try to lift them up and urge them forward. But what I found was in the culture where I lived, nobody was allowed to be a leader unless they were senior. That was death. Any sophomores, juniors put their hands up to lead, seniors shot them down. That's just that culture. That's just that culture. It may not be your culture, but since that was the culture I had, I needed to try to figure out, could I draw these seniors into owning the group and leading the group? I was on a trip with them, and I brought the seniors aside. I said, you seniors, you got to lead this group. It can be your group. You've got to lift it up. You got to lead it. You got to care for these kids. It's amazing. You won't believe how powerful this can be. And they said, oh, we're not really leaders. They don't look up to us. This is never going to work. We're kind of the losers of the high school. I don't think that I said, just go for it. Just try it. Just love them and lead them. Well, they didn't think they had done a particularly good job, but at the end of the trip, we were in a circle for final reflections and the candles passing around as they do at one of these things, and a junior girl says, I want to say something to the seniors. We love you so much. For the last 3 years, you have taken care of us, you have taught us, you have protected us. We love you so much, we're never going to forget you. We know you're going to college next year. We're going to miss you so much, but you are going to be loved even when you're not here. Those seniors ran to the middle of the circle crying, hugging one another, weeping and shaking. We never had a problem recruiting seniors ever again because everybody could see the power of what could happen if you poured out your love for the younger kids, how they would pour it back. There's a moment when you try to make this point. What we would do at the beginning of the year, we'd have a big gathering, didn't matter where it was, but if it was a nice day, we'd go out to Long Island Sound. And there comes a moment when you told the seniors, just take the kids down the beach without the adults. Take the kids down the beach and tell them what you're going to do this year as leaders of the group. And when the seniors take the kids down the beach without the adults and say, this is the most important part of our lives. We've been taken care of and our lives have changed because of what we've received in this youth group, and we are committing ourselves for this entire year to take care of you. We're going to take care of you. We're going to be there at the high school for you. We're going to be here for you. Walk into this space with us and something beautiful and powerful is going to happen. No adult can give that speech. No adult can have that impact. When you get to any relational time together, for instance in a lock-in, one of the things that's most important to transforming a group is creating a sense of affirmation. These young people know that they go through all week getting busted and judged and rejected, and they're not allowed at this lunch table, and somebody's snickering about that or passing gossips about that. You need a counterculture, and you can create a counterculture in your Vesper groups and your small relational group conversations with affirmation experiences. Now you know what these are. I'm just going to run through a couple of them because they're simple. One of them is just an affirmation book, right? Every kid's got a little notebook, and at the end of the trip or the lock-in or the retreat or the service day, you pass it around and everybody just writes 3 sentences what they love about that person. They treasure those books when they come back. We used to play a game called YG Spin the Bottle. All right, have I got your attention now? All right. Now here's the way it goes. You get 7, 8, 12 kids in a circle, and one child spins the bottle. Whoever it points to has to say what they love about the one who spun the bottle. Then the same one who spun the bottle spins it again, and then whoever that points to has to say what they love most about the person who spun the bottle. Then the person who spun says which one was most moving to them. See, this ups the game a little bit. You don't want to just toss off, oh, she's always so much fun, because then you're never going to get picked for that kind of a comment. The one who goes, I love the fact that no matter how down I am, she always takes a moment to come over and talk to me and makes me feel better about myself. Yeah, that person's going to get picked. And then they spin the bottle and it just goes around and around. Here's another one. Guardian angels. Doesn't matter how long the trip is, everybody puts their name in a hat, you pull out somebody's name and you are their guardian angel for the trip, the experience, whatever. Nobody knows who your guardian angel is, you don't tell anybody. But what you do is you do two things as someone's guardian angel. Every minute you try to make sure the person is cared for and loved without being too obvious about it. And every minute you try to pay attention, what's really amazing and wonderful about the person that I'm the guardian angel for? And then at the end of the trip, however long the trip is, you tell them. One by one, they go around the circle and they go, well, I was Bobby's guardian angel, and here's what I watched during the day we were together, 2 days we were together, whatever. Bobby is really amazing because when kids hear that affirmation, you know that you have to be loved into being able to love. You have to be loved into healing. When the affirmation cycle starts to take space over against the judgment cycle, it creates this safe space into which you are willing to risk your heartaches and your fears because you know you're accepted and carried and loved. And the worst thing about heartaches and fears and reversals is the isolating factor. What you've almost always got in a group is if it's 12 kids, you have 12 kids who think they're the only ones suffering something terrible and embarrassing. And they're totally isolated because they can't tell anybody. If anybody really knew, they would be excluded. But once this affirmation, love, and acceptance happens, they can begin to risk. I've never been quite well since my dad left my mom, and every day I cry myself to sleep. And the group gives them a big hug and says, we hear you, we know, my dad left too. Boom, I'm accepted, I'm not isolated, I'm part of this group, and I'm willing to hear your story and love you as well. The gold standard for transformation and nurturing development is when you can get some deep engagement in some social justice project where you're working to change the world together. That group throws its shoulder into a project, but here's what I want to say. What they're leaning in to do transformative justice ministry doing, and it doesn't matter what it is, always keep in mind that what they're doing is they're on a pilgrimage. Pilgrimages are going out of the place where you're comfortable and safe, with a group of people that you're traveling on the road with in the name of Christ, taking on the behaviors and culture and support for one another that is the Christian values over against the space at your home, traveling to the destination where you engage in the political movement, the march, the soup kitchen, the build, whatever you're doing, understanding and encountering Christ in the other, and then coming home and holding on to those values when you get home. There is the ultimate of relational bonds. Now, I just want to take a couple of questions because I'm probably running over and people are going to get mad at me. So, does anyone have a question for me? Shansia.
My question to you is, how do you promote an environment that not necessarily goes in depth towards the concerns of the youth? I'm meaning, sometimes I'm in fear of having to turn a session into a counseling moment because it's so intimate, not only to the students but to me, because at times I know there's nothing that I can do to ease this pain, and I also know that it will never go away to a certain aspect. And I don't want all my meetings, especially I'm from an urban community, I'm from the Bronx, sometimes I don't want my meetings to be a moment of just tears coming in, let's cry again today. How do I make the appropriate transition? Is that faith?
Yeah, well, there is, of course, what you tee up and set as the grounds for what you're doing, which can be diverse enough to be silly and fun and affirming and constructive and building. And you'll have all those experiences. But it's important that you also create space for the pain and the suffering to be shared, right? Yeah. So here's Henry Nouwen. Can you drink this cup? Henry Nouwen, great spiritual writer who began his career teaching here. Nothing is sweet or easy about community. Community is a fellowship of people who do not hide their joys and sorrows, but make them visible to each other in a gesture of hope. In community, we say, life is full of gains and losses, joys and sorrows, ups and downs, but we do not have to live it alone. We want to drink our cup together and thus celebrate the truth that the wounds of our individual lives, which seem intolerable when lived alone, become sources of healing when we live them as part of a fellowship of mutual care. So you also ask the question, what about when it gets too deep and raw and you're actually not equipped to handle that, right? So there are two things I think we really need to share here, and then I'm going to close. There are sources of suffering and pain and reversal where the power of the group and acceptance is incredibly healthy, and by sharing your story, as Nouwen says, and being received and loved anyway, you are drawn out of the isolation, which is the most powerful thing to begin with. But sometimes the story that comes out is not a fair thing to drop on other 14-year-olds because they can't handle it. So when the child says, as will come out sooner or later, you know, I tried to commit suicide twice this year. That's actually not a 14-year-old conversation. That's not a 14-year-old conversation. That's not a fair thing to land on a bunch of 15-year-olds. So you have this safe space, this holding space, but you have to pivot. You hear them. You receive them. You say, that's something I really want to talk to you about. And we're all going to pray about it right now, because at the end of the day, we're going to have to put this on God's altar. And I want to circle around you right now while we pray. But Susie, this is something you and I need to go get some help with together. I'm going to get you the help. I'm going to make sure you are attended to, but this is not the space for that. So you understand, I hear you, I'm here for you, but we can't do this right here. All right? And then you pivot to talking to them afterwards, and then you get them connected up with the kind of care they really need. All right? All right, I'm sorry. I have overrun my time as always. Thank you very much.